Welcome to this video, Arriving in Heaven with the Divine Will. We'll explore Luisa's insights into how a soul enters into heaven when living in the divine will, and that soul's effect on souls that are currently in heaven and souls that remain on earth. Also, the effect it has on all creation. And we'll also take another look into the 9 choirs of the divine will for further insight. Let us begin in the nome de Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. When the soul enters into heaven, it retains all the effects of the divine acts that it performed while living in the divine will and the infinite merits thereof. So when a soul enters into heaven, living in the divine will, it is like a sun, and all of its acts are the planets revolving around it in its orbit. They are retained to it, and we touched upon that a little bit in other videos when we discussed the nature of the author of the divine acts with the acts themselves. Now let us go to a first reading. The first is from volume 11, March 8, 1914. As she lives and dies in my volition, there is no good which she does not bring with herself, since there is no good which is not contained in my will. My will is a life of all the good that can be done by creatures. Therefore, dying to this life, the soul in my will carries with her the masses which are celebrated, the prayers and the good works which are done, since all of them are fruits of my will. And like I mentioned, it's not just the acts that are performed by someone living in the divine will that are retained, but the nature of the divine acts and the unity of the divine acts which are united together in the eternal act, they also are retained, and all the infinite merits. It is like a new creation that enters into heaven. And let me follow that up with another reading from the same volume and the same date. This is still very little compared to the work of my will itself, which the soul carries with her as her own. One instant of the work of my will is enough to surpass all the work of all creatures, past, present, and future. As the soul dies in my will, there is no beauty that matches her, no height, wealth, sanctity, wisdom, or love, nothing. Nothing can be compared to her. Nothing equals her. As the soul who dies identified with my will enters into the heavenly fatherland, not only will heaven's gates open, but the entire heaven will bow to welcome her into the celestial residence, to honor the work of my will which is in her. We have to remember that the gift of living in the divine will is a gift for these times, and that those souls that have entered into heaven previously, they were not fortunate enough to have this gift. And I'm going to switch to another reading. This one is from volume 23, February 28th, 1928. If you knew what difference will pass between those who bring my knowledges from earth and those who acquire them in heaven, the first will have them as their own endowments, and one will see in them the nature of the divine beauty, and will hear the same sounds of joy and happiness that their Creator makes one hear and forms. On the other hand, in the second, these will be neither their own nature nor their own endowments, but they will receive them as the effect of the communication of others, almost as the earth receives the effect of the sun, but does not possess the nature of the sun. And this gift And what distinguishes it is that, unlike in previous generations prior to Luisa, which were subject to the divine will, we have the opportunity of possessing the divine will. In early stages of our development within the divine will, we can have what they call divine will on loan. In other words, perform divine acts, but it's through participation with Jesus through us in the divine will. The other important aspect of this gift, aside from what I've already described about the nature of it and the ability to possess the divine will, is the timing of this gift. This gift is being provided in our time. And although there's great chaos and confusion and conflict, it's a wonderful time to be alive and to be able to possess this gift almost as the vanguard of those living in the divine will. Let us turn to another reading, and this is going back to Volume 11, March 8th, 1914. What can I tell you then of the feast and surprise of all the blessed in seeing the soul completely marked by the work of the divine will, or in seeing that all which this soul did during her life, having done everything in my volition, each saying, each thought, work, action, etc., are many sons which adorn her, each one different from the other for light and beauty. And in seeing the soul many divine rivulets, which will inundate all the blessed, and flow also upon earth, for the benefit of pilgrim souls, since heaven cannot contain them. So there's a lot there in those couple of sentences. Let's start with the soul living in a divine will and its effect upon souls that are living in earth. So the analogy of the divine will and the sun and the light and the heat are used very often in the Book of Heaven and in other writings of Luisa. You can consider a soul living in the divine will as having a certain gravity that affects and influences other souls around her. And when that soul leaves this earth, the impact that she has on other souls living on this earth is such as to sweep other souls into heaven. Because the gift and the nature of the divine will cannot be retained strictly in a soul. It cannot be contained even in heaven, as this excerpt describes. Now, the other aspect of it, which is maybe startling for many, that this cannot be retained, these gifts that are brought with a soul that lived in the divine will into heaven cannot be retained in heaven. It speaks to the effect of living in the divine will upon all creation. And this effect upon creation can be understood when you understand that the divine will exists throughout all creation. It is in everything and is everywhere, as Jesus explains to Luisa many times. Now let us return to the 9 choirs of the divine will to achieve additional insight into the arriving into heaven of souls living in the divine will. And the first excerpt that I'd like to bring up is just to remind everyone what the 9 choirs are about. After she will have formed them on earth, she, our Blessed Mother, will take them to heaven, surrounding herself with the new hierarchy, the newborn in the divine fiat. And that's from volume 35, August 9th, 1937. And that's setting up this sentence here from the same passage that I'd like to delve into a little bit more. This will be the fulfillment of the work of creation, our consummatum est. And consummatum est, of course, is Latin. And the best translation, in my mind, would be to regard that as our crown or our crowning, which fits very nicely into other excerpts out of the Book of Heaven. But the word I want to emphasize here is what's prior to that, the work of creation. And sometimes to understand things, it's important to see like what is not being said. It's not talking about the restoration of mankind. It's not talking about the improvement or restoration of souls. It's talking about the fulfillment of creation. That's what the third fiat is about. The gift of the divine will is not just a gift for man, it is a gift for all of creation. The third fiat presents us with the promise of a new heaven and a new earth. And it explains what St. Paul said to the Romans. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. Thank you for joining, and I hope you receive some benefit from this video. Please like and subscribe to help us promote this content. God bless.